The SQE1 results have just been released and many students are now looking through their transcripts. There are a few sections that might be a little bit puzzling to those who've got their results, and also if you've just started an SQE1 course or if you're curious as to what the SQE1 transcript looks like, stay here for the next episode on SQE TV.
If you wanna be solicitors, why don't you come and visit us at SQE TV?
So let's take a look at what a transcript looks like for the SQE1 assessments. And the first thing to say is that the one you can see in front of you is a mocked up version. It is not a real transcript of any student. Hence the reason why we've got the fictitious candidate name of Jonny sample transcript and a fictitious candidate ID. And the first thing you'll notice, of course, is that the two assessments that form part of SQE1, that's FLK1 and FLK2, have their marks set out separately. I've set them side by side here because we're looking at a landscape view if we're looking at this video on a PC. But when you look at it on screen, officially, your official transcript, FLK1 and FLK2 will be set out vertically. But let's have a look at the dates and discuss a little bit about those first, because that does warrant a bit of discussion if you've not been through the SQE regime yet. And that's because SQE1 is sat in 2 consecutive weeks, the FLK1 paper in week 1 and the FLK2 paper in week 2. But not every candidate sits the same paper. Why? Well, there are too many candidates and too few venues for everybody to sit on the same day. So what happens is there are 5 papers for FLK1 that are sat in week 1 and 5 papers for FLK2 which are sat in week 2. So basically you can choose a sitting on a Monday to Friday in each of the 2 weeks. Now this candidate sat the 2 assessments a week apart, but you don't necessarily have to do that. You could choose, as I recommend to a lot of students, to sit on the Monday or Tuesday of week 1, FLK1, and then on the Thursday or Friday, I recommend students sit FLK2. So you can maximise your revision time for FLK2 because the results have shown historically, in most cases, candidates tend to underperform on the second paper compared to the first paper. Most students will have the opportunity to decide which day of the week in each of the 2 weeks they sit FLK1 and FLK2. So make sure you take that into account when booking ahead a few months before the actual assessment.
SQE TV.
The date of the transcript, which is here the 10th of September 2024, doesn't warrant much discussion. That's simply the date that the results were released for this particular SQE1 sit. But the next 2 sections do warrant quite a bit of discussion. They deal with the attempt number and the deadline to pass the SQE. Now you can see this particular candidate was on their first sit of 3 because you have up to 3 sits for any assessment within a 6-year period, and that's critical. And therefore the deadline to pass the SQE for this candidate, and this is the whole of their SQE journey, including SQE2, is 6 years from the date of their very first SQE assessment. Here, the FLK1 assessment on the 18th of July 24. So they've got effectively until the 17th of July 2030 to pass their SQE2 exam.
SQE TV.
Just before we return to our video, if you like what we do on SQE TV, please do like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you tap the notification bell here, you make sure that you get access to our videos as soon as they drop. Now back to the video.
SQE TV.
I'm going to deal with the next 3 sections of the transcript together. So that's pass mark, your mark, and correct answers, because they can cause a little bit of confusion. Dealing with the last one first, correct answers, that's the easiest to explain. That's because there are 180 multiple choice questions on each of the 2 papers, and this student scored 124 out of 180 questions correctly on both of those papers. So far, so good. So the next question you're probably asking is why, when there are 180 questions on each paper, is the pass mark 300? And when, in this case, the student gets the same number of questions right on each paper, they end up with a different mark. Well, the reason all lies behind the timetable for the SQE assessments and the fact that candidates sit different papers on different days of the week for SQE1, FLK1 and FLK2. And inevitably there will be some difference in the level of difficulty between the assessments. So what the SRA's examiners have to do is to review the relative difficulty of the exams across each of the 2 weeks for FLK1 and FLK2 and work out which papers, and sometimes within each papers, which questions are more difficult, to come to a conclusion as to how to scale or adjust the marks to a mark out of 500 to level out the perceived difficulty of trying to make sure that there is parity of opportunity between candidates and between papers. So just to be clear, the SRA are trying to achieve a level playing field by going through this adjustment or scaling process. The next part of the transcript deals with the quintile you are in, and this candidate was in the first quintile for FLK1 and the second quintile for paper 2. What does a quintile mean? Well, basically it means for FLK1 this candidate was in the top 20%, and on paper 2, FLK2, this candidate was in the top 40% because they are in the second quintile. Candidates who fail the assessment will almost certainly be in the fourth or fifth quintile. And finally, you'll see that the overall result is stated at the end of each of the FLK1 and FLK2 transcripts. And it'll either be pass or not pass. And that's all it will say.
SQE
The last part of your transcript contains a breakdown of your marks. And what you can see is that the breakdown is given for the practice areas across each of the two papers. And this is very interesting if you pass to see where you perform better than others, but of course it's much more useful for people who are resitting because it'll show which areas you need to focus on in particular when it comes to your revision.
SQE
So there we are, that was a look at an SQE1 transcript. I hope you found that informative and it gave a bit of colour maybe to some of those items that you may not have understood when looking at your transcript if you've just sat and received your SQE1 results. Until next time, my friends, take care and cue the jingle.
If you wanna be solicitors, why don't you come and visit us at SQE1